The morning session of the Galactic Council started like any other day on Nexus Prime. Representatives from dozens of species filled the massive chamber, their voices mixing in a symphony of different languages and sounds. The translation devices worked overtime to make sense of clicking mandibles, melodic tones, and growling conversations. But something was wrong today, and it took several minutes for anyone to notice that Ambassador Lisa Grant's seat was empty. The human delegation had occupied the same section for over 200 years. Their seats were positioned perfectly to see all other representatives, a spot they had chosen carefully when humanity first joined the council. Lisa Grant had never missed a session in her 15 years of service. She was known for arriving early, staying late, and always having her notes perfectly organized in neat folders. Speaker Thanadar of the Valdorian hegemony called the session to order as usual. His three eyes scanned the chamber, pausing briefly on the empty human section before moving on. The Arcturians were discussing trade routes with their usual arrogance. The crystalline Logzari sat in perfect stillness, their bodies catching and reflecting the chamber's lights. The insect-like Zalani clicked and buzzed among themselves, planning their next territorial expansion. Nobody spoke about the missing humans at first. The first agenda item was a dispute between two mining colonies in the Outer Rim. Usually, Lisa Grant would have stood up with a carefully prepared compromise. She had a talent for finding solutions that made everyone slightly unhappy, but willing to accept the results. Today, the argument dragged on for 3 hours without resolution. The Arcturians wanted to claim the entire system. The Zilani demanded mining rights based on ancient territorial claims. The smaller species shouted over each other, trying to be heard. Commander Jake Morrison had been Lisa's military advisor for the past 5 years. His chair was also empty. Jake was a quiet man who rarely spoke during sessions, but his presence had always been reassuring to the human delegation. He had a way of standing that suggested he was ready for anything, and his calm gray eyes missed nothing that happened in the chamber. The other military advisors kept glancing at his empty seat, as if expecting him to materialize at any moment. During the lunch break, Representative Kekstal of the hegemony approached the human section. The area was completely deserted. No staffers organizing papers, no junior diplomats preparing briefings, no security personnel maintaining their quiet watch. Even the small human flag that had flown above their seats for decades was gone. Only empty chairs remained, arranged in perfect rows, as if waiting for occupants who would never return. Kekstal checked the diplomatic registry on his personal device. The human delegation was still listed as active. Their access codes were still valid. Their embassy quarters were still registered under their names. But when he tried to contact them through official channels, he received only automated responses, saying the messages could not be delivered. The afternoon session focused on trade agreements. Dr. Nina Brooks should have been present to discuss the medical supply contracts that kept dozens of species healthy and alive. Her research had led to breakthrough treatments for diseases that had plagued the galaxy for centuries. The Logzari had requested her presence specifically to discuss a new plague affecting their outer colonies. But her chair remained empty, and her research notes were nowhere to be found. As the day progressed, more representatives began to notice the absence. The Zalani security chief Vextar made discreet inquiries. The Arcturian trade minister demanded to know where the humans had gone. Even the usually indifferent Luxari seemed concerned, their crystal bodies shifting colors and patterns that indicated confusion and worry. Elder Keth of the Valdorian hegemony finally addressed the situation directly. His ancient voice carried across the chamber as he asked the question everyone was thinking. Where were the humans? The chamber fell silent for the first time in decades. No clicking, no buzzing, no melodic tones. Just silence. The official response came through automated systems exactly 1 hour later. A simple message appeared on every representative's personal device simultaneously. The text was brief and formal. The human delegation was withdrawing from the Galactic Council effective immediately. All treaties and agreements involving Earth and its colonies were hereby suspended. All human personnel were being recalled to human space. No further communication would be forthcoming. That was it. No explanation, no negotiation, no diplomatic courtesy. Just a cold, formal notification that humanity was done with galactic politics. Representative Zixana of the Arcturian Empire laughed when she read the message. She called it typical human drama, predicting they would return within a month, begging to rejoin. The humans were young and emotional, she declared to anyone who would listen. They would realize their mistakes soon enough and come crawling back. To the superior species who actually knew how to run a galaxy, the Luxari responded with mathematical precision. They calculated a 73.2% probability that this was a negotiation tactic. Humans were known for their unpredictable strategies, they reasoned. This was simply another attempt to gain leverage in upcoming trade discussions. Their crystal forms flickered with patterns indicating mild amusement at human simplicity. But Elder Keth remained troubled. His 3 eyes focused on the empty human seats with an intensity that made younger representatives uncomfortable. He had lived for over 800 years and had seen many species come and go from the council. Something about this departure felt different. Final. The evening news. Broadcasts across the galaxy treated the story as a minor curiosity. Human withdrawal was the 3rd item after trade disputes and weather reports. Most species barely paid attention. Humans had always been the quiet ones anyway, working behind the scenes rather than making dramatic speeches. Their absence would hardly be noticed. Security footage from the embassy level told a different story. Commander Jake Morrison had been seen moving through the corridors with calm efficiency, collecting personal items and data cores. He carried himself with the same steady confidence as always, but there was something in his expression that suggested this was more than a temporary departure. When approached by Zelani security officers, he had simply nodded politely and continued his work. The human embassy quarters were found completely empty by midnight. Every piece of furniture, every personal item, every scrap of paper had been removed. The walls were bare, the floors were clean, and even the climate control systems had been reset to default settings. It was as if humans had never lived there at all. As Nexus Prime settled into its artificial night cycle, the galaxy began to realize that something unprecedented had just happened. For the first time in over 2 centuries, humanity had chosen silence over diplomacy, withdrawal over engagement, and mystery over explanation. 6 standard cycles had passed since the humans disappeared from the Galactic Council, and the first real problems were starting to show themselves across the galaxy. What had seemed like a minor diplomatic incident was slowly revealing itself to be something much more serious and far-reaching than anyone had imagined. The medical crisis hit the outer rim colonies first. Dr. Susan Carter had been running the main pharmaceutical production facility on Kepler Station for 12 years. Her team of human scientists had developed most of the advanced medicines that kept dozens of species healthy and alive. When the withdrawal order came, they had packed up their research and left within hours, taking all their knowledge and expertise with them. The Zelani colonies in the Vega system were the first to run out of the anti-radiation drugs that allowed their workers to operate in the dangerous mining environments of their homeworlds. Without these medicines, the Zelani could not extract the rare metals that powered most galactic technology. Mine Supervisor Kextal watched helplessly as his workers began showing signs of radiation poisoning after just a few days without their protective treatments. The Arcturian Empire tried to produce the medicines themselves, but their scientists could not figure out the complex chemical processes that Dr. Carter's team had perfected over decades of careful research. Every attempt resulted in useless compounds that had no medical value. The proud Arcturians were forced to admit that they had never bothered to learn how their medicines were actually made, content to simply buy them from human suppliers. Commander Steve Baker had been in charge of the massive agricultural systems that fed the Outer Rim territories. His hydroponic farms and automated growing systems produced food for over 50 billion beings across dozens of worlds. The technology seemed simple enough on the surface, but it required constant adjustments and maintenance that only human engineers seemed to understand fully. The food shortages began 3 cycles after the humans left. The automated systems continued, working at first, but slowly began producing smaller and smaller harvests. The delicate balance of nutrients, temperature, and timing that kept the farms productive was maintained by human technicians who made thousands of tiny adjustments every day. Without them, the systems began to fail in ways that seemed impossible to fix. Captain Maria Santos had designed the shipping routes that moved goods efficiently between star systems. Her logistics algorithms had revolutionized galactic trade by finding the fastest and cheapest ways to transport everything from raw materials to finished products. The computer systems that ran these routes were still working, but they began making mistakes that created chaos throughout the shipping industry. Transport ships found themselves waiting for days at stations that had no cargo for them to carry. Essential supplies were sent to worlds that did not need them while colonies ran out of basic necessities. The Luxari tried to recalculate the shipping routes using their advanced mathematical abilities, but their rigid thinking could not account for the hundreds of variables that human logistics experts had learned to manage through experience and intuition. The communication networks that connected the galaxy were also beginning to show signs of strain. Engineer Paul Grant had spent 15 years upgrading and maintaining the quantum relay systems that allowed instant communication across vast distances. His team had created backup systems and redundancy protocols that kept the networks running smoothly even when individual components failed. Without human maintenance crews, the relay stations began experiencing more frequent outages. Messages took longer to reach their destinations, and some communications were lost entirely. The Zilani military found that their command structures were breaking down as orders failed to reach distant fleets in time to be useful. The problems were not just technical, but also social and political. Ambassador Lisa Grant had spent decades building relationships between different species, helping them find common ground and resolve their differences peacefully. Her quiet diplomacy had prevented dozens of minor conflicts from escalating into major wars. Speaker Thanadar of the Valdorian hegemony called emergency sessions of the Council to address the growing problems, but the discussions quickly devolved into arguments and blame. The Arcturians accused the Zilani of hoarding medical supplies while their own colonies suffered. The Zilani blamed the Luxari for disrupting trade routes with their mathematical calculations that ignored practical realities. The smaller species found themselves caught in the middle of these disputes with no one to mediate their concerns. The human delegation had always been willing to listen to complaints from minor worlds and find ways to address their problems. Without that voice of reason, the council chambers echoed with shouting matches that accomplished nothing. Dr. Nina Brooks had been conducting research on interspecies cooperation at her laboratory on Research Station Omega. Her work had focused on understanding how different species could work together despite their biological and cultural differences. When the withdrawal order came, she had wiped all the data cores clean and shut down her experiments permanently. The station commander tried to access her research files, hoping to understand what had made human cooperation so effective. He found only empty computer systems and a single message logged in the station records. The message was brief and cryptic, mentioning something about being asked to choose sides when all they wanted was to build something better together. Military. Leaders across the galaxy were also beginning to realize how much they had depended on human tactical support. Admiral Karain Hayes had been known for her flexible approach to combat strategy, able to adapt quickly to changing situations in ways that other species found difficult to understand. Her absence was felt most keenly during the border skirmishes that were beginning to break out between various territorial claims. The rigid military doctrines of most species worked well in predictable situations, but they struggled to cope with unexpected developments or creative enemy tactics. Human officers had always been able to improvise solutions to problems that their alien counterparts could not solve using standard procedures. Long-range sensors detected something that added to the growing sense of unease across the galaxy. Every human military vessel had simultaneously jumped to hyperspace and vanished without leaving any trace of their destination. Over 60,000 ships of all sizes had disappeared in a coordinated exodus that spoke of careful planning and preparation. The precision and efficiency of the human withdrawal was becoming more apparent with each passing day. This had not been an emotional decision made in anger or frustration, but a carefully planned operation that had been prepared months or perhaps years in advance. The realization that humans had been planning their departure while still serving faithfully in their various positions was deeply unsettling to the remaining species. As the cycles passed and the problems multiplied, the galaxy began to understand that they had lost something irreplaceable when the humans chose silence over continued participation in galactic civilization. The war began over something as simple as mining rights in the Kepler Nebula, a dispute that would have been resolved in a single afternoon session if the humans had still been present at the council. Admiral Rex Morrison of the Zilani fleet faced off against Commander Thaxara of the Arcturian Empire over rights to extract rare crystals from the asteroid fields that drifted through the colorful gas clouds. For 300 years, such disputes had been handled through careful negotiation and compromise. The human delegation had developed a reputation for finding creative solutions that gave each side something they wanted while preventing anyone from getting everything they demanded. Ambassador Lisa Grant had mediated 47 similar conflicts during her time in office, always managing to find middle ground that kept the peace. Without human mediators, the two fleets simply stared at each other across the nebula for weeks. The Zilani claimed ancient territorial rights based on maps that were older than most galactic civilizations. The Arcturians insisted that their superior technology gave them the right to exploit any resources they could reach first. Neither side was willing to back down, and neither side knew how to compromise. The first shots were fired when a Zilani mining ship accidentally drifted too close to an Arcturian patrol vessel. Both crews were nervous and trigger-happy after weeks of tension. The mining ship's captain tried to explain that his navigation systems had malfunctioned, but the Arcturian commander interpreted the approach as an attack. Within minutes, both vessels were exchanging fire. The battle escalated quickly as reinforcements arrived from both fleets. What should have been a minor incident became a major engagement when Admiral Rex Morrison felt compelled to defend his. Miners and Commander Thaxara decided that Arcturian honor demanded a strong response. The fighting spread throughout the nebula as ship after ship joined the battle. Speaker Thanadar of the Valdorian hegemony tried to arrange an immediate ceasefire, but his emergency communications were ignored by both sides. The battle protocols that had been established centuries ago assumed that human peacekeepers would be available to enforce any agreements. Without neutral forces to monitor compliance, neither the Zilani nor the Arcturians trusted the other side. To honor a ceasefire, the Lungzari withdrew into their crystal cities and declared the conflict beneath their notice. Their mathematical minds calculated that the war would eventually reach a stable equilibrium, where both sides would exhaust themselves and accept peace. They failed to account for the emotional factors that drove both species to continue fighting. Long past the point where logic suggested they should stop, the smaller species were forced to choose sides or flee to the outer systems. The peaceful Dorian Republic found their trade routes cut off when they refused to provide ships to the Zelani fleet. The aquatic Nereid colonies were attacked by Arcturian forces when they continued selling their biotechnology to Zelani customers. Species that had lived in harmony for generations suddenly found themselves drawn into a conflict that had nothing to do with their own interests. Captain Dan Woods had been the senior human military advisor attached to the Joint Peacekeeping Forces. His strategic planning had prevented dozens of potential conflicts from escalating into actual warfare. The peacekeeping protocols he had developed assumed that human officers would be available to coordinate between different species whose military doctrines were often incompatible with each other. Without human coordination, the various peacekeeping forces could not work together effectively. The Valdorian fleet used formation tactics that required precise timing and coordination. The Luxari preferred to operate independently with minimal communication between ships. The smaller species had developed defensive strategies that worked well for protecting their own territories but were useless for offensive operations. The bureaucratic systems that governed galactic law also began to break down as the war spread. Attorney Henry Walsh had spent 40 years interpreting the complex legal frameworks that held the council together. His expertise in interspecies law had been essential for resolving the countless disputes that arose when different legal systems came into conflict with each other. The council's emergency powers were activated for the first time in over a century. But the ancient charter proved nearly impossible to interpret without human legal experts. The document had been written by multiple species, using different languages and legal concepts that did not translate well between cultures. Human lawyers had served as interpreters and mediators, helping different species understand how their own legal traditions fit into the broader galactic framework. The War Crimes Tribunal that was supposed to investigate atrocities committed during the conflict could not function without human judges who understood the legal systems of all participating species. Evidence was presented in formats that other species could not interpret. Witnesses gave testimony that made perfect sense in their own cultures, but seemed like nonsense to judges from different backgrounds. Dr. Amanda Foster had been studying interspecies psychology for 25 years, documenting how different species could learn to work together despite their biological and cultural differences. Her research had identified the key factors that made cooperation possible and the warning signs that indicated when relationships were beginning to break. Her archived papers, discovered in abandoned research facilities, painted a clear picture of the crisis that was now unfolding. She had predicted that removing human mediators from galactic politics would lead to exactly this kind of cascading failure. Different species would retreat into their own cultural comfort zones and lose the ability to understand or trust each other. The economic networks that connected the galaxy were also collapsing as the war disrupted trade and manufacturing. Supply chains that had been optimized for efficiency over centuries were breaking down as planets chose military production over civilian goods. The careful balance between different economic systems was maintained by human economists who understood both the technical aspects of interstellar trade and the cultural factors that influenced how different species made financial decisions. The Arcturian Empire began converting their civilian manufacturing facilities to produce military equipment, causing shortages of consumer goods throughout their territory. The Zelani response was to seize control of shipping routes and impose tariffs on goods moving through their space. Other species retaliated with their own trade restrictions, creating a spiral of economic warfare that made the actual military conflict seem small by comparison. As the war entered its 6th month, casualty reports showed that over 2 million Beings had died in what should have been a simple mining dispute. The sophisticated early warning systems that had prevented such conflicts for centuries had failed completely once humans were no longer available to operate and maintain them. The galaxy was learning that the species they had dismissed as young and emotional had actually been the foundation that held their entire civilization together. The search fleet assembled at Nexus Prime was the largest operation in galactic history, with over 200 ships from dozens of different species working together for the first time since the war began. Captain Rexan of the Valdorian hegemony commanded the expedition alongside Commander Sithara of the Zelani fleet, their species temporarily setting aside their differences to solve the mystery of human disappearance. The fleet's mission was simple in concept, but overwhelming in scope. Find the humans and bring them back to restore peace to the galaxy. Every remaining species contributed ships and personnel to the search, driven by the desperate hope that human mediators could somehow undo the damage that had been spreading across civilized space for over a year. The journey to human space took 3 weeks through hyperspace routes that had been traveled regularly for centuries. Trade ships and diplomatic vessels had made this trip thousands of times, carrying goods and messages between human colonies and the rest of the galaxy. The search fleet expected to find busy space lanes and crowded systems full of human activity. And commerce. Instead, they found emptiness that defied belief and understanding. The first human colony they reached was New Geneva in the Alpha Centauri system. The planet had been home to 12 million humans who worked in advanced manufacturing and research facilities. Long-range sensors detected no energy signatures from the surface, no ships in orbit, and no communication signals of any kind. Silence was complete, and absolute. Commander Sithara led the first landing party to the planet's surface. Her team found cities that looked like they had been abandoned for decades rather than months. Every building was empty, but perfectly maintained, as if the inhabitants had simply walked away from their lives without taking anything with them. There were no signs of struggle or hasty departure, just the eerie cleanliness of spaces that had been carefully prepared for. Abandonment. The manufacturing facilities that had produced advanced technology for half the galaxy were not just empty, but completely dismantled. Every piece of equipment had been removed with surgical precision, leaving behind only the basic infrastructure of power conduits and structural supports. It was as if someone had performed the largest moving operation in history with perfect efficiency and unlimited time. Dr. Paul Grant had designed the orbital defense platforms that protected most human colonies from asteroid impacts and hostile forces. The search fleet found these installations not just deactivated, but physically removed from their positions. Only the mounting brackets and severed power cables remained, floating in orbit like the skeleton of some massive creature. The economic implications were staggering. Human colonies had been major manufacturing centers for medical equipment, agricultural technology, and communication systems used throughout the galaxy. The complete removal of this industrial capacity represented a loss of productive capability that would take decades to replace, assuming other species could even figure out how to recreate human manufacturing processes. Captain Lisa Morris had commanded the orbital shipyards above New Terra, where human engineers built vessels for clients across the galaxy. The search fleet found the massive construction facilities completely gutted. Every tool, every piece of machinery, every computer system had been removed. Even the raw materials stockpiles were gone, leaving behind empty storage bays that echoed with the sounds of the search teams. Footsteps. The efficiency of the evacuation became more apparent with each world they visited. This had not been a panicked flight from danger, but a carefully planned withdrawal that must have taken years to organize and execute. Every human facility had been stripped of valuable equipment and technology while leaving the basic infrastructure intact for potential future use. Engineer Steve Wilson had spent 20 years building the terraforming systems that made marginal worlds suitable for human habitation. His atmospheric processors and weather control networks were found shut down and partially disassembled. The search teams realized that humans had been preparing for this departure long before they announced their withdrawal from the Earth Council. The most disturbing discovery came at the research stations where human scientists had been working on experimental projects in cooperation with other species. Dr. Susan Carter's medical research facility on Kepler Station had been completely emptied of all equipment and data. Even the experimental subjects had been removed, leaving behind only empty laboratory spaces and sterilized equipment. The search fleet's xenobiologists tried to analyze residual traces left behind by the human evacuation. They found evidence of advanced transportation technology that had been used to move massive amounts of equipment and personnel in a very short time. The scale of the operation suggested coordination between human military and civilian authorities that went far beyond normal emergency procedures. Commander Jake Morrison had been responsible for coordinating human military forces throughout this region of space. The search fleet found his command centers completely abandoned, but still functional. Computer systems remained active and continued running. Automated maintenance routines, but all strategic data and communication logs had been wiped clean. Only basic operational manuals remained, as if humans had left behind instruction books for whoever might eventually take over their facilities. The trail led the search fleet deeper into human space toward Earth itself, the origin point of human civilization and the symbolic heart of their interstellar empire. Long-range sensors detected no artificial energy signatures from the solar system, suggesting that even humanity's home world had been abandoned along with all their colonies. The approach to Earth revealed the most shocking sight of all. The planet that had been covered with massive cities and industrial complexes for over 4 centuries had been completely restored to its natural state. Orbital telescopes showed continents covered with forests and grasslands where sprawling metropolises had stood for generations. The search fleet established orbit around Earth and sent landing parties to investigate what had once been the largest human cities. Captain Rexon personally led the team that landed at the site of former New York, expecting to find ruins or abandoned buildings. Instead, they found pristine wilderness with no trace of the 20 million people who had lived there just months earlier. A single monument remained where the city center had been, a simple stone marker that bore an inscription in multiple languages, including the native tongues of every species represented in the search fleet. The message was brief, but carried implications that sent chills through everyone who read it. We tried to share the stars with you, but you chose to own them instead. We leave you to your choice. 3 years had passed since the human withdrawal, and the galaxy bore little resemblance to the thriving civilization that had once connected hundreds of worlds in peaceful cooperation and trade. The Galactic Council officially dissolved on a cold morning when Speaker Thanadar of the Valdorian hegemony called the final session to order with only 12 representatives present in the vast chamber that had once held delegations from over 60 species. The war between the Zalani and Arcturian fleets had finally ended not through negotiation or victory, but through mutual destruction. Admiral Rex Morrison and Commander Thaxara had led their forces into one last desperate battle over the ruins of a mining station that no longer produced anything valuable. Both fleets had been reduced to burning wreckage drifting through space, their crews dead and their cause forgotten by the survivors, who struggled to rebuild their shattered civilizations. The smaller species that had been caught in the conflict found themselves alone in a galaxy that no longer offered protection or support for those too weak to defend themselves. The peaceful Dorian Republic had been forced to abandon half their colonies when trade routes collapsed, and they could no longer import the food and medical supplies needed to sustain their population. Their elegant cities stood empty while refugees crowded into overcrowded camps on the few worlds that still maintained basic services. Dr. Amanda Foster's research papers had been discovered in the abandoned libraries of human research stations, and her work was finally being studied by xenobiologists, who were desperate to understand what had gone wrong. Her predictions about the collapse of galactic civilization without human mediation had proven accurate in every detail. But reading her warnings 3 years too late offered no comfort to the species that now struggled to survive in the chaos. Economic networks that had once moved goods efficiently between star systems had completely broken down without human logistics expertise. Captain Maria Santos had designed shipping algorithms that optimized trade routes for hundreds of variables, including fuel costs, cargo capacity, political stability, and seasonal demand fluctuations. The replacement systems created by other species were crude approximations that resulted in massive waste and chronic shortages of essential goods. Entire worlds found themselves cut off from galactic commerce when the Lasari attempted to redesign trade routes using pure mathematical optimization. Their crystal minds could calculate the shortest distances between star systems, but could not account for the political and cultural factors that made some routes practical while others led to conflicts or delays. Colonies that had thrived for centuries suddenly faced starvation when supply ships stopped arriving. The communication networks that had connected the galaxy were failing more frequently as quantum relay stations broke down without human maintenance crews. Engineer Paul Grant's backup systems and redundancy protocols had kept the network stable for 3 years after his departure, but the technology was finally succumbing to the inevitable entropy that affected all complex systems without proper care and attention. Governments found themselves unable to coordinate with their own colonies as messages took weeks or months to reach their destinations. Military commanders lost contact with distant fleets, leaving them to operate independently without orders or support. The careful synchronization that had allowed galactic civilization to function as a unified whole was replaced by isolated pockets of activity that grew more disconnected with each passing day. The medical crisis that had begun in the outer rim territories had spread throughout civilized space as stockpiles of human manufactured medicines ran out completely. Dr. Susan Carter's pharmaceutical production facilities had been the primary source of treatments for dozens of diseases that affected multiple species. Without these medicines, plague and sickness spread unchecked through populations that had forgotten how vulnerable they were to biological threats. The Zelani mining colonies were the first to be completely abandoned when radiation poisoning made their operations impossible without human-developed protective drugs. The rare metals that powered most galactic technology were no longer being extracted, leading to cascading failures in everything from transportation systems to communication networks to basic life support systems on space stations. Commander Steve Baker's agricultural systems had finally failed completely, leaving the outer rim territories without reliable food sources. The hydroponic farms and automated growing systems that had fed billions of beings required constant adjustments that only human engineers had fully understood. Attempts by other species to maintain the systems had resulted in soil depletion, crop failures, and environmental damage that would take decades to repair. The few remaining stable governments attempted to fill the roles that humans had once performed, but their efforts were hampered by the fundamental differences in how various species approached problem-solving and cooperation. The Valdorian hegemony's rigid hierarchical structure could not adapt to the flexible decision-making that human situations required. The Luxury's mathematical precision failed when dealing with the emotional and cultural factors that influenced interspecies relations. Military conflicts erupted regularly as species competed for dwindling resources and struggled to maintain control over their remaining territories. Without human peacekeepers to mediate disputes and enforce agreements, Every disagreement had the potential to escalate into armed conflict. The sophisticated early warning systems and crisis management protocols that had prevented wars for centuries were useless without human operators who understood how to interpret the complex data they provided. A final message from humanity was discovered in a derelict communication relay station on the edge of known space. Commander Steve Baker had left a personal log that explained in simple terms why humans had chosen to abandon the galaxy they had helped to build and maintain for over 3 centuries. The log revealed that humans had spent decades trying to teach other species how to cooperate and solve problems together, but their efforts had been met with condescension and dismissal. Other species had been content to let humans handle the difficult work of mediation and compromise while they pursued their own interests without concern for the greater good. When forced to choose between their principles and the demands of species that saw them as useful servants rather than equal partners, humans had chosen to leave rather than continue enabling a system that went against everything they believed about cooperation and mutual respect. The galaxy learned too late that the species they had dismissed as young and naive had been the heart and soul of their civilization. Without human laughter in the station corridors, human curiosity pushing at the boundaries of knowledge, and human compassion bridging the gaps between different ways of thinking, the stars seemed dimmer, and the universe felt smaller and more lonely than anyone had imagined possible.